First of all, what do you make,
Thank you,
Professor Brenner, of the possibility that the United States is being condemned if not lifting its embargo against Cuba now at the UN headquarters?
Well, of course, the vote will be the same. Last year, there were 3 abstentions by 3 essentially puppet countries of the United States, Palau, Micronesia, and it might be a sign this year if the United States allows those countries to vote with the other countries of the General Assembly. But the importance of this is really symbolic. And I think that the problem for the United States was acknowledging that the embargo is both illegal and that because it's extraterritorial, and that the embargo has cost Cuba so much, which in fact it has. And so until the United States actually understands that and doesn't suggest that the embargo will be lifted only if there is change in human rights, then I think we're in for some difficulties.
Mr. Alzugaray, though, the United States has been using the issue of human rights against Cuba, not for now, but for 5 decades, if not more. Do you think the issue now between the 2 countries are human rights or face-saving for Washington?
I think that's, that's the way that the United States tries to, unsuccessfully by the way, to justify, to legitimate its policy. The embargo was always about regime change. Originally, it was to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the Cuban government. That's the exact words of a State Department document at the time. So human rights shouldn't be an issue to keep the embargo on, but for the simple reason that there are many situations in the world in which the United States maintains relations with differences on human rights. And the way to go forward on this issue is to talk to both sides. Cuba is not a perfect society. The United States is not a perfect society. And we should be able to discuss that, but with normal trade. One important thing, this is immoral, because what the United States is trying to do is make the Cuban people pay for the differences that the United States has with Cuba's political system.
Mr. Brenner, we see the warming up of relations. We also see some possibility of exchanges, including travel, trade as well, and exchanges of personnel. And yet, if embargoes remain, what would that mean for the Cubans? Does Washington have a clear idea of how much this would hurt the general atmosphere that Cubans feel about the earlier agreement with Washington?
Oh, I think that the Obama administration is aware of the impact of the embargo. And as the president said, he would like to remove the embargo. In fact, in some ways, if the United States voted in favor of this resolution in the UN, it might make it more difficult in the Congress. The reaction by the Republicans, who are very far to the right, they would get their steam up again in terms of trying to oppose any changes. So by going along, in some ways, the president doesn't arouse that. There are some other issues the president is concerned about also. We have, for example, an ambassador to Mexico that the Republicans have stopped until now because she was involved in the improvement of relations with Cuba, and he would like to get her nomination approved by the Senate.
Well, the U.S. domestic politics have always been very complicated. Mr. Alzugaray, do you think the Cuban people should pay for the complication of the U.S. politics as a result, for example, by not having the embargo being lifted?
Well, certainly, this is one of the major issues right here. I mean, Cuba is ready to talk to the United States on the basis of mutual respect, on the basis of civilized relationship. That's what President Raul Castro has called for. Is this civilized? Come on, this is not civilized. And frankly, if the embargo had to be approved today by Congress, it wouldn't be approved by Congress today. It's a small minority of Republican legislators who oppose changing a policy that has failed. Everybody knows that it has failed. I would add that it is immoral, illegal, and it costs the United States very much, like it's going to cost today. It wouldn't look very good for smart power or soft power, whatever you want to call it, that 188 or 190 countries vote against the United States at the United Nations.
But then the question is, Mr. Alzugaray, what can Cuba do at this moment if the U.S. would not approve that? What can Cuba do? And how would the Cuban leaders turn their back and then go to their people and say, this is what happened, we have to accept it? Or they're going to say, well, what about our agreement with Washington? If Washington is not acting, we are back away also from the agreement. So which choice do you think, Mr. Alzugaray, Cuba would take?
You cannot expect any concession from Cuba on this issue. It would be acceptable for the Cuban people. We have resisted for over 50 years the embargo. Why should we make concessions now? It is a failed policy. The world repudiates it. So concessions from us, I think that's really, it gets the United States nowhere. What Cuba can do, and I think that's what the government is doing and what the people are doing, is demonstrating that we can resist, that resistance, that we can resist, and that we can maintain that resistance, and at the same time, what we are doing, which is updating the Cuban economic model so it becomes more efficient, even with the embargo, and that's what's happening.
That's what's happening over the past 5 decades, as some of the Cubans argued. But Professor Brenner, what would that mean for the United States? I mean, of course, this UN fight, we have seen that over many years in the past. But this year is very different because Washington and Cuba, Havana, has this agreement now. Of course, it's with the White House, but still, it is going to be very different. And therefore, what would that mean, Professor Brenner? That's my question. Toward the other countries who are trying to seek agreements with the United States about long-time standing, conflicts or cold relations. Professor Brenner.
First, I agree with Dr. Alzugaray about his analysis of what Cuba has done. Let me also say about human rights. I would say at this moment in Cuba, the worst human rights violations are being committed on Guantanamo Naval Base that's controlled by the United States. But with respect to what the impact of this vote is, I think that it makes it more difficult for the United States to pursue a smart policy with respect to the rest of the hemisphere. Look, China, for example, is already making very important inroads in trade with Cuba. Other countries in the region are trading with Cuba. The United States is being left behind. And U.S. businessmen are aware of this. Every week, there are groups of U.S. Businessmen who are going down to Cuba to try to figure out a way to go around this embargo and establish new trade relations. So I think the United States, the pressure from these business people will soon force the Congress to change the embargo.
Really, Professor Brenner, you're that optimistic? I mean, you are, after all, in the presidential election season, and each candidate could just leash out the word that they really like without paying for the consequences politically, well, in a campaign, right? And therefore, vast opinions and extreme opinions are very much likely to be expressed. At this moment, who will have the say? I mean, is that easily to be swayed, the U.S. So-called congressional attitude?
Let me make clear what I meant by soon. I've been looking at this for almost 50 years also.
All right, then.
So by soon I meant in the next presidential administration starting in 2017. I think at that point, business people will be able to convince members of Congress to change. I'd say before the end of this decade, there will be an end to the embargo.
Well, Mr. Alzugaray, do you think the Cubans will be as patient as Professor Brenner, who has been looking at the issue for 5 decades?
Well, we're going to be patient about the United States. You know, in the long run, they have to change. Let me give you an example how the embargo right now, you call it the embargo, I call it the blockade, but let's compromise, illegal economic sanctions. how that impacts even in the interest of the American people. Americans are now allowed more to travel to Cuba. In January, the Treasury Department announced that Americans could use their credit cards in Cuba. Well, you know what? They haven't been able to do that because all these sanctions out there. Something has to be done. And of course, American businessmen are not making business in Cuba,
right.
better business in Cuba, because the embargo is stopping them. And that
right.
means jobs in the United States. So eventually, I agree with Dr. Brenner. We will have the embargo lifted at some point in time before 2020.
Mr. Alzugaray, before we go, I want to have a very brief question for you. It is estimated from the Cuban side that $833 billion since 1960, since the embargo or blockade was put in place by the United States against Cuba. So what does Cuba have in mind about this amount of huge cash that has lost over the time as a result of embargo? What is likely to be the future, the near future between Cuba and the United States with all of this in mind?
Well, I think that this is a very lawful and right decision of the Cuban side to bring up the issue of the damage paid to Cuba, the damage caused to Cuba by the embargo, which has to be paid. Now, the problem is that we accept also, the Cuban government accept that it has to compensate for American properties that were nationalized. And this is a way of evening up the score. Yes, Cuba is ready to negotiate compensation for American properties that were nationalized, but at the same time, Cuba will say, well, you know what? You owe me money too. So let's see how this turns out, how this, this is finally negotiated, which eventually will be negotiated.
Okay, Professor Brenner, we got 10 seconds left. The final words from you.
I agree with Dr. Alzugaray, and I hope that this vote does not set back relations. I think Cuba is more mature than the United States and will understand it as domestic U.S. politics.